Hello, my name is George English. I'm the Director of Research Through People. So we make these videos to cover topics of interest to various ones, and this one's targeted at those of you in America and Canada who had ancestors who emigrated from Britain, from England, Scotland, Wales or Ireland, and to give you a bit of an idea of what may be involved if you ask us to have a look at your ancestors. So here's an example, someone where ancestors emigrated in the 19th century, and what we find very often, of course, isn't just one ancestor. There may be a number who went over at different times because in America or Canada they married 10, 50 or more years later. So in this case, these various families, Buck, Spencer, Muir and Lewis, and you could see in fact they came from Scotland, England and Wales at various times. So let's have a look. In England, they were particularly from the Midlands of England, from various counties like Nottinghamshire. Scotland, around Edinburgh and Clackmannanshire and so on, but also from the very north of Scotland, Caithness, and Welsh ancestors too, from Glamorgan. And when did they go over? So just to sort of chart it here, first one, 1844, an ancestor went from Scotland, and then 1845 and Caithness, 1850, and then the Welsh people, 1856, 1858, someone went over from Leicestershire, 1861, and so this is the sort of pattern we very often find. What's different about us researching your ancestors from there is, as I say, very often there are a number of people who emigrated at various times. Now, what we find particularly, everyone's interested in their ancestors, where they came from, but of course in this case American and Canadian knowledge of Britain is less than people who live here, just as it would be the same for us in America. So here we are, William Smith Muir. He's born in 1822 in Bannockburn. I wonder if you've heard of that, but in the middle of Scotland, in the central area, in Stirlingshire. There's a photo of him. We were lucky to get some photos of a number of the ancestors, and there's an old photo of Bannockburn. Now what Bannockburn is particularly famous for, and every Scot will tell you this, is the Battle of Bannockburn, fought more than 700 years ago. In 1314, when the army of the Scots of Robert the Bruce defeated the English army. And to this day that's something very significant for the Scots, and so Bannockburn is very much considered a landmark moment in Scottish history, and you can visit there. And I'm sure many of you will have seen the film Braveheart. This particular features William Wallace, the build-up of 15-20 years before then. So a bit of history there if you come over and see your ancestors and where they lived. Now William Smith Muir, he married Jane Robb in Bannockburn in 1844, and straight away they emigrated. We found the ship they emigrated on, the Swanson, arriving in America within a couple of months of getting married. And of course with the American connection, we were able to in fact find their gravestones in America many years later, which again added something to this tale. So one of the great things is when we combine with yourselves, or we can do our research in America these days. Amazing with technology. So let's look at another one. Let's look at Joan Luff, who in fact emigrated in the early 1900s. Now she's born in Worcestershire, in the middle south of England, and she marries someone called Sengus. Now of course he's got a whole background. He was living in Michigan, but his father had moved from Canada, and the family in fact were German by origin. But on Joan's side, her father was born in Middlesex near London, and mum also came from Worcestershire. Now you can see Frederick was killed in the First World War, and so mother is left on her own, and you can see in 1926, some 10 years later, mother Kate emigrates with daughter Joan to Michigan. So looking back, the Luffs were from the East End of London. You may have heard about Cockneys, whole story there, whole different way of speaking as well. On Kate's side, they were from Worcestershire, so there's George and John, so we got back more than 200 years. John's from Marden and Herefordshire. Well, what's it like going there? Well, Worcestershire, Herefordshire, very rural area, a lot of market gardening, fruit and vegetables and so on. So here's a photo of Marden Village, where John Nicholas was born. Now, what can you do if you come over? Well, interesting enough, more and more these days there are footpaths and trails and so on and so forth. So there's the 200-mile Marches Way, which comes down from Chester and it passes through Marden. So people very often come over and perhaps spend 3 or 4 days doing that sort of thing, literally walking in the footsteps of their ancestors. Now, son George, he's born in Pershore, about 30 miles from Marden. Also a market town on the River Avon. You may have heard of Stratford-on-Avon, where Shakespeare came from. Vale of Evesham, very much renowned for market gardening and fruit, referred to as a gems town. There are about 50 of these outstanding conservation areas, so lots to see. The abbey goes back 1,000 years and so on. So we not only try and bring your ancestors to life, but help you understand the sort of lives they went to. And it's great when people come over and go to where their ancestors came from. Now, I'm going to throw in here, I have emigrant ancestors who emigrated to America 400 years ago, and I'm sure you've all heard of the Mayflower. So I actually have an ancestor, Richard Warren, who was on the Mayflower in 1620. The following year, Philippe de Lannoy, whose name was changed to Philip Delano, was on the Fortune, and you may know Roosevelt was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now, a very special thing about people on the Mayflower, so much effort has been put into researching them. About half of them have descendants. They reckon something like 35 million. In terms of finding out, you can buy books of typically the first 5 generations down from that person. Normally we're working back in time and it becomes harder and harder, but in fact if you have an ancestor, easier to do that. Now, the reason I'm sitting in Britain, not America, is a couple of hundred years ago, Henry Delano came back to England. And I regard myself very much as knowledgeable about the Mayflower. I've done more than 100 talks and presentations on it. But I think it means when people like yourselves get in touch, I can really empathise and understand the way you see things from America, the way you look at Britain, and that can help to literally bring your ancestors to life. Now, I'm not going to go into detail here, but what happened with the Mayflower and the Reformation, big religious upheaval and so on, there's things happened shortly after Columbus had discovered the New World, and eventually that would lead to those who were on the Mayflower separating from the Church of England and going across to Leiden in Holland before going on the Mayflower. Virtually everyone on the Mayflower were English. I also have an ancestor who was from Flanders. In fact, the Delanois, Philippe's parents, were from a place called Torquay-en-Lyon. Now, that was ruled by the Spanish, and they experienced far worse than the English, terrible persecution and so on. They fled across to England at first and then joined those in Holland. And the reason I'm mentioning this partly is I've just published a book about them. Philip Delano and Francis Cook, who was on the Mayflower. And one of the things I find is I've published in academic journals, but most people find that hard to follow. What we want is a readable story that brings our ancestors to life. So very much the target of the book is just that, to make it a readable story. Historical and social background, not very well known, particularly in America, even for those who know about the English pilgrims. So I go into that and then their specific lives, what happened to them in Flanders, England and Leiden, and it's a genealogically based book, so I have a summary of that. Interesting, over more than 100 years I found 47 publications, some with some very good information, but a lot of wrong information, incorrect claims and so on, as can happen with the Mayflower and so on. So very much looked at these and reviewed them so others could come along and know what to believe and what not. And in this case, 5 US presidents descend from these people, including Roosevelt, who I mentioned, and Winston Churchill, the English Prime Minister or British Prime Minister. His mother was American. So if you're interested, you can buy this book from the Lulu bookstore. Just Google Lulu, there's a web URL, and hope that you would find it very interesting. So over the years we've made lots of videos to bring to life, and very much in your case I've made a video presentation about the book and the background, and made ones on the Mayflower, and then specific ones about Britain. So for example, I put there London, Scotland. Surnames is a topic that we find people are very interested in, so made various videos about the surnames, and what can you expect. So we sat down with 3 couples and talked to them about what they got out of us researching their ancestors. So if you're interested, please feel free to get in touch. We offer a free consultation. Send us basic information, let us have a look, because we don't know before we start what it may be like. We have a look at the information that's available and assess the options, and we come back to you then with the options that we suggest and the associated fees. Contact details are there. You can email us at info@researchthroughpeople.com. Give us a ring if you want, and we very much look forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much.